The world Karl Marx entered was already trembling with the hum of machines. By the time he began to write, Europe's skies were no longer clear. They were painted in soot. The year was 1818, and the old order of kings and serfs had been replaced by something new, something that felt both miraculous and monstrous. Iron rails crisscrossed the continent like veins of a new organism. Steam engines shrieked through valleys once known for quiet rivers. The age of industry had arrived, and humanity had, perhaps unknowingly, stepped into its own experiment. Factories rose like temples of a new faith, the faith of progress. Inside, men and women stood at assembly lines, turning out cloth, coal, and steel. But what they produced in abundance, they lost in meaning. A man could make 1,000 shirts in a week, and still not own one that fit him. A woman could feed an entire city's textile demand, yet starve in her tenement room. The world Marx saw was not one of freedom, but of transformation, and not all of it kind. Marx's genius and his curse was that he saw the hidden logic beneath the smoke. He saw that industry wasn't merely a technological revolution, it was a moral one. The machine did not just replace muscle, it replaced value. The craftsman's pride gave way to the factory's quota. Skill was no longer a virtue, efficiency was. And beneath that shift, Marx detected the hum of something deeper, a new way for one class to live off the labor of another. In the polished cafes of Paris and the parlors of London, the wealthy celebrated progress. They toasted the new sciences, the birth of rail, the endless possibilities of industry. But a few streets away, the world that fed that prosperity was coughing its lungs black in mines and mills. Cities swelled with migrants who no longer worked the land, but worked the gears. They slept in rooms stacked 4 to a bed. They aged by 30. Their hands shook from fatigue. Their wages barely purchased bread. And yet, the strange paradox of capitalism was already visible. The more efficient the machine, the poorer its maker seemed to become. Productivity soared, misery persisted. The industrialists claimed this was temporary, that the rising tide would lift all boats. But in the alleys of Manchester and the slums of London, the tide seemed to be lifting only yachts. Marx absorbed all of this, not as a mere observer, but as a man caught between worlds. He was born into the educated middle class, too refined for the factory floor, too poor for the bourgeois comfort he despised. He lived much of his life in debt, often borrowing money from his lifelong collaborator and friend, Friedrich Engels, whose father, ironically, owned factories employing the very workers they wrote about Marx's mind, was revolutionary. But his reality was contradictory, a man railing against capital while dependent on it to survive. Still, in the quiet of night, he wrote feverishly. His study in London was stacked with books and unpaid bills. His children slept hungry. The candlelight flickered as he filled notebooks with theories that would shake empires. He was not yet a prophet, just a desperate thinker trying to explain why the modern world felt so hollow. Why had progress produced misery? Why had liberty birthed dependence? The answer, he believed, lay in the structure of ownership. The capitalist owned the means of production, the machines, the factories, the capital, while the worker owned only his labor. And labor in this new era was not an act of creation, but of survival. The worker sold his time, his body, his attention. His humanity became a commodity. To Marx, this was not progress, it was inversion. The worker was now the raw material, and the machine was the master. He began to see history itself as a pattern, a succession of systems built upon exploitation. Feudalism had chained peasants to lords. Capitalism had merely replaced the lord with the employer, the manor with the factory, the whip with hunger. The names changed. The structure endured. In this realization, Marx found both fury and faith. He believed that capitalism contained the seeds of its own destruction, that by concentrating wealth and alienating labor, it would eventually implode under its contradictions. He envisioned a coming revolution, not of kings or armies, but of workers, a collective rising of those who had built everything yet owned nothing. But beneath this grand vision lay something more personal, more human: grief. Marx grieved for what had been lost: the craftsmanship of the individual, the intimacy of labor, the connection between what one made and what one was. He saw industrial life as a kind of spiritual erosion. Man had become a tool among tools. The England of his exile symbolized this perfectly. London, with its endless chimneys and fog, was both monument and warning, proof that the engine of progress could also be an engine of despair. In the streets, children sold matches, and women stitched until their fingers bled. The price of civilization was being paid in silence. And yet, amidst this gray epoch, Marx saw a glimmer of destiny. He believed the system would not last forever. Just as feudalism had decayed, capitalism would someday collapse beneath its own weight. From its ruins, a new world would emerge. One without masters or slaves, without rich or poor, where the worker would reclaim his full humanity. It was a vision both beautiful and naive, but it electrified generations to come. His words would be carried to continents he would never see, translated into tongues he could not speak, and interpreted in ways he could never have intended. The irony was already seeded in the soil of history. Karl Marx, the man who wrote of equality, would become the intellectual cornerstone of some of the most unequal regimes in human memory. But for now, in the candlelight of his London study, he was just a philosopher staring into the machinery of revolution and seeing for the first time its soul. The more Karl Marx wrote, the more his mind turned toward one obsession: value. Not money, not wealth, but value itself. What gave anything meaning? What made it worth something? To him, this question was the key that could unlock the machinery of the entire world. For in every system of exchange, behind every coin or contract, hid an invisible equation. Someone's labor, the energy, skill, and time of a human being, was being translated into numbers, and those numbers into power. But that translation, Marx believed, was rigged. He saw it in the factory floors of London and the shipyards of Hamburg. The worker spent 12 hours shaping iron, spinning thread, or driving rivets, only to find that the profit he produced flowed upward, away from him, into the pockets of men who had never touched the product. The worker created the value, the capitalist captured it. And so Marx began to articulate what would become one of the most famous and controversial economic theories in history: the labor theory of value. It was an audacious claim that the worth of any good at its core came from the amount of socially necessary labor embedded in it. Labor created value, capital merely appropriated it. For Marx, this wasn't just economics, it was a revelation. The world he saw was not driven by innovation or luck or moral worth. It was driven by extraction. Every product, from a loaf of bread to a locomotive, was built on a small act of theft. The capitalist paid the worker less than the true value of his labor, the difference being surplus value, the source of profit. To Marx, this was not just unfair, it was unsustainable. He called it exploitation masked as efficiency. But to understand the radical power of this idea, one must imagine its world. Factories then were not places of convenience or comfort. They were crucibles. A worker's body was worn out by 35. The sound of machines was relentless. the air a haze of cotton dust or coal. Labor was not simply a task. It was sacrifice. When Marx said that labor created value, he was also saying that suffering created civilization. Every polished brick in the bourgeois home was mortared with exhaustion. Every coin was embossed with the callous of someone unseen. In his notebooks, Marx wrote of labor as a double-edged condition, the very thing that dignified human existence, yet also the tool of its subjugation. To work was to express oneself, to imprint thought upon matter. But under capitalism, work no longer belonged to the worker. His time, his skill, his spirit, all were commodified. Labor became a product that could be bought and sold. Man, in the process, became estranged from his own essence. This, to Marx, was tragedy. The factory was not merely a place of production, it was a mirror of alienation. He saw workers reduced to extensions of machines, their creativity flattened into repetition, their individuality erased by the division of labor. He wrote, "The worker becomes all the poorer the more wealth he produces." It was both observation and prophecy. But the brilliance of Marx's critique was also its flaw. He mistook a pattern for a destiny. He saw exploitation as the core of capitalism, but not its engine of evolution. In time, capitalism would learn to survive its own contradictions. It would use innovation and even temporary justice to sustain itself. Wages would rise, conditions would improve, and yet the imbalance would persist, only hidden deeper. For every machine that replaced a man, a new dependency was born. Every efficiency extracted a bit more time, a bit more thought. The exploitation that once consumed bodies would one day consume minds. In that sense, Marx wasn't wrong. He was early. He described the alienation of the factory worker, but the same logic now governs the modern office, the gig economy, the algorithmic labor of invisible clicks and scrolls. We have traded the hammer and the loom for the keyboard and the screen. The tools changed. The structure did not. Yet, as history unfolded, Marx's theory hardened into ideology. His followers tried to quantify labor's worth in rigid formulas. Governments turned his ideas into commandments, forcing production quotas in his name, forgetting that his critique had been human before it was political. Marx had sought understanding, not doctrine, and yet, in the cold hands of bureaucracy, the living pulse of his theory became mechanical. Still, the labor theory of value echoes like a ghost through the modern world. Every time a worker asks, "Why am I paid less than the company earns from my work?" Marx's question returns. Every time a creator's work enriches a platform but not the creator, his words find new relevance. The 19th century's mills have been replaced by digital empires, and though few speak of surplus value today, it thrives invisibly, harvested not from sweat, but from attention. We are all laborers now, in a global factory of information, feeding machines with our clicks, our thoughts, our hours awake. Marx saw this in its infancy, a system that converts the living pulse of humanity into an endless stream of value. But perhaps the deepest irony is this. Marx believed that once people recognized their exploitation, they would unite. Instead, capitalism learned to flatter its subjects. It told workers they were entrepreneurs, that their labor was freedom. It wrapped exploitation in choice. Now the factory is everywhere. And nowhere. The overseer wears a friendly logo. So when Marx wrote that all value is derived from labor, he was pointing to something more eternal than an equation. He was describing the moral architecture of civilization, that everything of worth, from the pyramids to the microchip, began with human effort, but rarely ended in human benefit. He believed history was a struggle between those who create and those who own. That struggle continues. though its battlefield has shifted from factory floors to cloud servers. The modern proletariat does not carry pickaxes. It carries passwords. Marx's words still hang in the industrial fog of our own age, where attention is mined like coal and data replaces sweat. The question he asked has not been answered, only disguised. What is value and who decides? When Karl Marx wrote of alienation, he was not speaking of philosophy in the abstract. He was describing the quiet despair he saw etched into human faces every day. He believed the industrial age had severed something ancient, the link between the maker and the made, between labor and life. Once, to work was to create. The farmer's harvest fed his family, the craftsman's chair carried his signature, the painter's brush expressed his soul. But in the world Marx inhabited, work no longer carried a name. It carried a number. The product left the worker's hands and entered a system that turned it into profit for someone else. In that moment, Marx said, man became alien to himself. He called it Entfremdung, estrangement. To be estranged was not merely to be poor. It was to be exiled from meaning. The worker became a stranger to his own life. He no longer decided what he made, how he made it, or why. He did not own the product of his labor, nor the tools that shaped it. He did not even own his time. In that estrangement, Marx saw the deepest wound of capitalism, not exploitation of the body, but of the spirit. He wrote that the worker was alienated in 4 ways: from the product of his labor, which belonged to another; from the process of work, which he did not control; from his own nature as creative being, and from his fellow man reduced to competitor. To work became to endure. The world, in its new efficiency, began to consume the souls it once celebrated. Factories turned into prisons of repetition. Workers stared at endless rows of machinery, performing the same motion thousands of times a day. The rhythm of the machine replaced the rhythm of thought. The individual became a cog, both essential and replaceable. For Marx, this was not a metaphor. It was anatomy. The very muscles of humanity were being restructured to fit the machine's pace. Alienation was everywhere. It hid in the tremor of a hand that had lost purpose, in the emptiness of a gaze fixed on profit charts, in the way cities grew denser yet lonelier. It was not merely economic. It was existential. He saw alienation extend even into the bourgeois class. The owners, too, became possessed by the system. They could not stop producing, selling, expanding, for to pause meant to be devoured by competition. They were captains steering a ship they could not slow. Capitalism, Marx wrote, enslaved not only the poor, but the powerful, each chained to the engine of accumulation. And yet, the profound irony, the system appeared to work. The trains ran on time. The markets flourished. The cities glittered with light. Alienation became invisible because it was normal. To live without connection to one's labor became the condition of modern life. Marx believed this condition could not last forever. He imagined a revolution of consciousness, a return to wholeness, a society where labor would again become creative, cooperative, meaningful. He called it species being, the fulfillment of our nature as collaborative creators. But history would not unfold as gently as he hoped. The 20th century took Marx's diagnosis and turned it into prescription. Nations claimed to cure alienation by abolishing private property, collectivizing work, unifying purpose. But instead of restoring humanity, they erased it further. The individual became a statistic, the collective a machine even larger than the one Marx despised. Alienation evolved. It did not end with the fall of the factory system. It metastasized into new forms: cubicles, offices, brand identities, digital screens. The modern worker no longer hears the roar of machines. He hears the hum of servers, the ping of emails, the infinite scroll of data. He works not with iron, but with information, yet the feeling is the same. Disconnection, exhaustion, the subtle awareness that the hours traded for survival no longer build anything tangible. Marx's prophecy, once industrial, is now digital. He wrote of alienation as estrangement from the product. Today we are estranged from ourselves. Our labor has become invisible, dissolved into algorithms and metrics. We perform, post, optimize. Yet the outcome belongs to corporations whose servers we never see. The worker of Marx's age built machines. The worker of ours feeds them. He mines data instead of coal, polishes brands instead of metal, writes code instead of manifestos. And yet the question remains the same. Who owns the result? The tragedy of alienation is its subtlety. It rarely announces itself with pain. It creeps through comfort, through jobs that pay well yet feel empty, through lives optimized yet devoid of intimacy. In Marx's world, alienation was the cry of the oppressed. In ours, it is the quiet hum of distraction. He foresaw the symptoms: isolation, commodification, the transformation of human life into measurable output. But even Marx, in his relentless critique, could not imagine a century in which people would voluntarily alienate themselves, offering their time, their attention, their private lives to digital platforms in exchange for validation. We are both the worker and the product now. Our emotions, preferences, and behaviors are mined, priced, and sold. Alienation has become participation. Marx warned that when labor becomes detached from life, the human being becomes hollow. And yet in that hollowness, systems thrive. Perhaps his greatest insight was not about economics at all. It was psychological. He understood that the human being cannot bear meaninglessness for long. If stripped of creation, we invent it. If deprived of connection, we simulate it. The marketplace of alienation becomes a theater of imitation, where identities are marketed, relationships commodified, and authenticity traded for visibility. It is a tragedy that echoes across centuries. The worker at the loom and the worker behind the laptop share the same question. Where does my life go when I give it away by the hour? Marx's alienation was the scream beneath progress, a voice still faintly audible in our times of noise. The world may no longer look industrial, but its logic remains mechanical. The gears are quieter now, but they still turn. When Karl Marx died in 1883, only a small handful of mourners followed his coffin through the cold drizzle of Highgate Cemetery. The man who had sought to reimagine the destiny of humankind was buried almost unnoticed, another exile laid to rest in foreign soil. And yet, within a few decades, his words would ignite revolutions that would redraw the map of the earth. They began as whispers in the factories, then as pamphlets passed hand to hand, then as flags raised over capitals. By the early 20th century, Marx's ideas had escaped their books and entered the bloodstream of nations. To the poor and the powerless, he seemed a prophet, the man who had explained their suffering and promised its end. But as with all prophets, those who followed him would carry his message further than he ever intended. The world Marx predicted did not arrive, but the world built in his name did. The promise was intoxicating, a society without exploitation, without hierarchy, without hunger. It was a dream that had haunted humankind for millennia, paradise regained, heaven on earth. But utopias are fragile things. When built with human hands, they tend to crack under the weight of human nature. In 1917, the first Marxist revolution seized power in Russia. The Tsar was overthrown. The workers, they said, had inherited the world. Factories, land, and capital were taken from private owners and placed into collective control. For the first time in history, the idea of Marx was no longer a theory. It was law. But in the transition from thought to power, something darkened. Revolution demanded purity. Dissent became betrayal. The dream of equality became a mechanism of control. The new rulers claimed to act in the name of the people, but their rule became absolute. In Moscow, committees replaced markets, and planning replaced freedom. Production targets were declared holy numbers. Failure to meet them was treason. Art was censored, speech monitored, and individuality treated as corruption. The same machinery Marx had condemned, the machinery of exploitation, was rebuilt with red paint. Factories still roared, workers still obeyed. Only now their master was not the capitalist, but the state itself. The capitalist class had been abolished, but hierarchy had merely changed uniforms. The revolution devoured its children. The gulags, filled with farmers and poets, intellectuals and soldiers, all accused of disloyalty to the dream they had helped to build. Marx's name was invoked like scripture, his words quoted in trials, his image hung on walls beside portraits of those who claimed to protect his vision. The failure of utopia was not a failure of intention, it was a failure of comprehension. Those who seized power in Marx's name misunderstood the man. They took his critique of exploitation and mistook it for a manual of construction. But Marx had offered no blueprint for governance, only a diagnosis of a disease. The cure, it seemed, was far more deadly than the illness. The Soviet experiment spread. From Eastern Europe to China, from Cuba to Cambodia, leaders adopted the Marxist vocabulary of liberation. Each promised to free the worker, to equalize wealth, to end history's injustices. Each built a new hierarchy, a new apparatus of fear. The century that followed was marked by what Marx had not foreseen: a bureaucracy more controlling than any market, a censorship more suffocating than any church, and a violence more methodical than any monarchy. And yet, it would be dishonest to see only failure. The rise of Marxism also forced the capitalist world to evolve, to soften, to reform. Fear of revolution gave birth to labor rights, social safety nets, welfare states. The very societies that rejected Marx still lived in dialogue with his ghost. But for those who lived under the hammer and sickle, the cost of paradise was paid in silence. Generations grew up pledging allegiance to equality while standing in bread lines. Innovation withered under suspicion. Curiosity became danger. The dream of a classless society hardened into the monotony of conformity. In time, the weight of the system collapsed under its contradictions, just as Marx had once predicted of capitalism. By the late 20th century, the statues fell. The red flags came down. And beneath them, millions of citizens discovered that the utopia they had built had left them poorer, lonelier, and more disillusioned than before. The failure was not only political, it was spiritual. When you try to perfect the human world, you must first perfect the human being, and that no revolution can achieve. Marx's dream had been born of compassion, of the desire to restore humanity to its rightful dignity. But in the pursuit of that dignity, human freedom was the first thing to die. Perhaps this is the curse of all utopian projects, that they begin in empathy and end in authority. The moment a dream becomes doctrine, it ceases to breathe. The moment equality is enforced, it ceases to inspire. And yet, buried beneath the wreckage of failed revolutions, something of Marx's fire endures. The desire for justice, for dignity, for meaning in labor, these remain universal. Even now, in boardrooms and digital platforms, the tension between those who create and those who profit endures like a pulse beneath the world's surface. Marx's mistake was to believe that systems alone could redeem us. But his insight, that power distorts, that wealth concentrates, that alienation corrodes the human spirit, remains painfully alive. The failure of utopia is not the end of Marx. It is his second beginning. His work has become a mirror, not of ideology, but of our recurring blindness. Each generation builds new systems, promising liberation, and each in time discovers the same truth. You cannot legislate away the flaws of the human heart. You can only recognize them and design around them. As the 20th century ended, Marx's visage faded from public squares, but his question still lingers in the smog of progress. Can there ever be a system that serves humanity without consuming it? The world has tried revolution, reform, deregulation, and digitalization. Yet the dream persists, that somehow, one day, we might learn to build wealth without exploitation, power without domination, order without tyranny. It remains, perhaps, the last utopia, one we still chase through screens, systems, and slogans. And if Marx could see us now, the hyper-connected algorithmic descendants of his industrial age, he might recognize the pattern, sigh deeply, and whisper what he wrote long ago. History repeats itself, first as tragedy, then as farce. The world Karl Marx imagined has vanished, yet its shadow stretches across every glowing screen. The smoke of factories has lifted, replaced by the silent hum of servers. Where soot once marked the worker's face, blue light now marks the eyes. The gears are invisible, but they turn faster than ever. The old industrial chains have become data streams. The proletariat now logs in instead of clocking in. And somewhere in the circuitry of the 21st century, Marx's ghost lingers, still whispering that the structure remains unchanged. For what is an algorithm, if not the new foreman? It directs labor, measures output, disciplines behavior, and rewards obedience, all without raising its voice. The worker no longer toils beneath smokestacks, but beneath metrics. The assembly line has been replaced by the feed. Marx believed that capitalism's final form would be global, borderless, ceaseless, devouring. He was right, and capital now flows not through nations, but through networks. Wealth moves at the speed of light, inequality at the same pace. The bourgeoisie of today are no longer factory owners, but platform owners, those who own the servers, the code, the attention. They do not employ, they host. They do not command, they influence. And yet the dynamic is the same. One class produces, the other extracts. Marx called it surplus value, the difference between what labor creates and what it receives. In the algorithmic age, that surplus is no longer measured in goods, but in data. Every click, every scroll, every post feeds the digital machine. The product is no longer tangible. The product is you. The digital worker of today is both creator and commodity. His labor is unpaid, disguised as participation. He builds empires of engagement with his attention, unaware that every gesture is monetized by the system. He is free, and utterly unfree. This is capitalism's greatest magic trick, to make its subjects believe they are sovereign while binding them more tightly than ever. The modern worker no longer feels alienated because alienation has been gamified. The dopamine reward replaces the wage. Validation replaces ownership. Marx could not have foreseen the infinite scroll, yet he would have recognized its logic. The same feedback loop that once turned men into machines now turns minds into metrics. Each of us performs, not for a wage, but for relevance. Each of us produces, not for survival, but for recognition. And in this theater of performance, the system thrives. Automation was supposed to free humanity from labor. Instead, it has redefined labor as existence itself. Even leisure has been absorbed into the economy. Our rest is monetized, our curiosity tracked, our dreams predicted. In the algorithm's gaze, we are inputs. Each moment of thought a fraction of value. And yet, Marx's voice still resonates, a warning transmitted through time. He once wrote that capitalism, left unchecked, would turn everything, even morality, even love, into exchangeable value. Today, that prophecy feels less like philosophy and more like code. Influence has become currency. Emotion has become asset. Privacy has become collateral. But perhaps the most haunting echo of Marx lies not in economics, but in psychology. He believed that human beings were meant to create, to express their essence through meaningful labor. When that labor loses purpose, the soul sickens. We now live amid abundance, and yet feel starved of meaning. Our machines have learned to think, but our minds have forgotten why. And so we chase purpose through consumption, mistaking novelty for fulfillment. We scroll to feel alive, unaware that we are scrolling through our own exhaustion. It is alienation without awareness. Estrangement wrapped in entertainment. If Marx's 19th century was defined by production, ours is defined by distraction. Both achieve the same end: obedience. But there is another twist. Artificial intelligence, the culmination of centuries of mechanized labor, has begun to replicate the worker entirely. The machine now writes, paints, predicts, decides. In this mirror, humanity faces its final question. When labor is no longer needed, what remains of value? Marx saw history as a sequence of revolutions, each born from contradiction. The contradiction of our time is this: we have built a world that no longer needs us, yet cannot function without our constant attention. We are both indispensable and obsolete. And perhaps, hidden within that paradox, lies the final revolution, not of class, but of consciousness. To see through the illusion of productivity, to recognize that value does not arise from output, but from awareness, to reclaim the right to simply be. Marx would not have recognized this digital landscape, but he would have understood its hunger, the endless drive for accumulation, optimization, and growth. He might have looked at our glowing devices and called them what they are: portable factories of the self. Each user a laborer, each moment a transaction, each silence an opportunity for profit. Yet even now hope persists. In small acts of resistance, art made for no reason, time spent without record, communities built without profit, the ancient human impulse reappears. The same impulse that Marx defended. The yearning to create without coercion, to live without ownership. The algorithm cannot calculate that. It can predict behavior, but not meaning. It can mimic creativity, but not wonder. It can measure attention, but not love. Perhaps that is where Marx's legacy ends. and where something deeper begins. The dream of equality has failed. The dream of autonomy remains. And in that quiet space beyond economics, in the stillness between data and desire, we may finally find what Marx spent his life searching for. Not a system, but a soul.